alien hand syndrome is a bizarre disorder which causes a patient to lose control of their own hand. They typically perceive the hand as not belonging to them, reporting that the hand has a mind of its own which does whatever it wants to do, like grabbing things or interfering with daily tasks, or even doing more egregious things like attacking the patient. What is interesting though is that this is not caused by abnormal activation, but instead by disrupted inhibition, meaning everyone's brain is generating this activity, but someone with alien hand syndrome can't inhibit it. This video is all about how your own brain could generate an alien hand, why your alien hand might want to attack you. There are many ways that alien hands can cause disruption, from putting your cereal away when you are trying to make breakfast, to undressing yourself after you have just buttoned up your shirt and are running very late for work. And while the syndrome typically affects the hand, misbehaving legs have also been reported in alien limb syndrome. Here, patients report being unable to stop walking, or conversely, being stuck to the ground. The reason why alien hand syndrome is interesting is because it is not a typical movement disorder. While most movement disorders affect more simple motor areas of the brain, alien hand syndrome affects so-called higher order motor areas, which control voluntary movement. In other words, instead of affecting motor regions which coordinate the movements you want to make, instead it is, in effect, a disorder of free will, in which you lose the ability to choose which movements you want to make, movements that your brain is already trying to generate and that you might want to terminate. When your ability to do this is damaged, this exposes a kind of alien in your brain. Your motor system is a complex hierarchical network which is distributed throughout the brain and involves multiple brain regions. The story starts when you want to make a movement. When you decide to move your hand, for example, this plan or decision is generated by your frontal lobes, and specifically by the supplementary motor area, or SMA. The activation of the SMA then activates another part of the brain called the primary motor cortex. And it is the primary motor cortex which actually generates the movement, because it activates motor neurons in the spinal cord, which then go on to activate your muscles, which produces the movement. There are also additional brain regions along the way, but these are not so relevant for us in regards to alien hand syndrome. However, when planning movements, your motor system also receives signals from other structures, like the parietal lobes, as well as from the cingulate cortex, which have important roles in integrating sensory, proprioceptive, and motivational information. All of these inputs help inform you about what kinds of movements you should make. And finally, there is another important structure for movement called the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum is a white matter bundle which connects both sides of the brain like a bridge and enables information across both hemispheres to be integrated. And you may already be aware that in most people, the right hand is controlled by the left side of the brain, and vice versa for your left hand and right hemisphere. This is called contralateral control. Therefore, to enable both hands to work together to complete a task, the corpus callosum is critical. Otherwise, you end up with two competing motor plans, or two fighting hands. Depending on which of these regions are affected, whether it's the SMA, the primary motor cortex, parietal lobes, cingulate cortex, or corpus callosum, this all determines the kind of alien hand activity that is observed. Whether it's grabbing, levitating, smacking, it all depends on which region is being affected. Which brings us to the next section. Altogether, there are 3 different subtypes of alien hand syndrome. These 3 subtypes include frontal, callosal, and posterior. The first subtype, which is the frontal subtype, is characterized by the hand making its own searching or groping movements. This subtype is mainly associated with lesions to the SMA, but also to other frontal or cingulate regions. The SMA is important because it normally inhibits bilateral limb activity by suppressing other motor areas in case they activate. In other words, damage to the SMA causes disinhibition, because the SMA is no longer inhibiting the primary motor cortex on the other side of the brain. Furthermore, neuroscientists have found that in people with alien limb syndrome, activation of the primary motor cortex, without the SMA or other areas, was associated with these involuntary movements, whereas normal movement generates activity in all of the motor areas. So the frontal subtype seems to be caused by damage to decision areas which are no longer able to inhibit the primary motor cortex, the part which causes your muscles to move. The second variant is the callosal subtype, callosal meaning of the corpus callosum. Damage to this structure causes intermanual conflict. In other words, it stops both hands from being able to work together, as information can no longer be shared across hemispheres, leading the hands to try to achieve separate tasks. This is why alien hands may fight each other, or you, when trying to achieve a certain objective, such as grabbing onto the other hand while it is trying to do something, or removing objects which the other hand is trying to use. Can you even imagine how insanely annoying that would be? And as an interesting aside, a stammer is also caused in part by both hemispheres fighting each other specifically for the control of speech. Normally the left hemisphere is dominant for language, but when the right hemisphere becomes too active, you get a stutter. And finally, for the posterior variant, this type is caused by very different regions. In other words, the parietal lobe as well as the thalamus. The thalamus is a structure located at the top of the brainstem. Both of these structures also contribute to movement, with the parietal lobe being concerned with a sense of ownership of your own body and where things are in space, while the thalamus generally refines motor movement. Accordingly, a patient with this subtype will experience hand levitation or uncoordinated hand movements. It also gets quite interesting with this subtype. For example, one patient only had arm levitation if they were walking, whereas another would only exhibit arm levitation when they coughed or if they heard a sudden noise, and a third would only experience it if they were lying down on their back. There is also considerable overlap in symptoms across the three subtypes. This mixing suggests that damage can occur across these different regions in individual patients. For example, one patient with a callosal hemorrhage extending into the medial frontal lobe exhibited intermanual conflict alongside compulsive grasping movements. On the other hand, this leads us to another question. Alien hand syndrome exposes the reality that our brains are constantly attempting to generate multiple different kinds of motor movements at any single moment, and that our brains merely choose which of these motor movements that it wants to allow to be performed, while suppressing the motor movements that it wants to inhibit. A neurotypical person may therefore feel reassured that whilst these patients may have impaired free will, that they themselves do have free will, as they can suppress the motor urges that they don't want. But in reality, research over the years actually suggests that this may not in fact be the case. Back in the 1980s, an experiment was performed by a neuroscientist named Benjamin Libet. In this experiment, he and his colleagues decided to investigate the role of consciousness in this process, and they found some incredible results. In their experiment, participants were asked to make movements with their hands. And each time the participants moved their hand, they were instructed to note down when they made the decision, using a type of clock on the screen in front of them called an oscilloscope. Here, Lebet discovered that the participants' motor areas were activating, but before the participants reported consciously making the decision to move. In other words, that their brains were already planning and executing the movement before the subjects were even conscious of deciding to move their hand. Which begs the question, how can a person decide to do something if their brains are already doing it? This would imply that free will is an illusion, that it is simply your brain reflecting on what it is already doing, and that you then call that process free will. Naturally, these experiments have been replicated numerous times over the decades, but their implications and methodology have been fiercely debated by neuroscientists, as well as by psychologists and philosophers. It is very natural to feel that we have free will in our daily lives, until we have a craving for something we shouldn't eat, or when we want to buy something that we can't really afford, or when we want to procrastinate instead of work. Nonetheless though, most of us do still feel that we have ownership over our own undesired actions, just as the patient with OCD does when they want to perform their ritual just one more time, or when the patient with trichotillomania wants to pull out just one more hair. Unless we have alien hand syndrome, our experiences are still coupled with a sense of self-agency, despite this oxymoronic lack of self-control. But you can find out more about that in future videos.